You know that feeling when you witness something so wrong, so unjust that it makes your blood boil? Well, what you're about to hear will shake you to your core. This is the story of how one racist cop's prejudice led him to make the biggest mistake of his entire career. And when he found out who he really arrested, his whole world came crashing down. Marcus Davis sat on the weathered bench in Riverside Park, the late afternoon sun casting a warm golden glow over the lush greenery surrounding him. He turned a page in his book, momentarily losing himself in the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing on the swings nearby. The park was one of his favorite places, a small sanctuary in the bustling city where he could clear his mind and escape the overwhelming demands of his high-stakes job. After weeks of intense undercover operations and dangerous field assignments, he desperately needed this moment of peace. Today, though, his well-deserved rest was about to be interrupted in the most shocking way possible. Across the park, Officer Brian Harkins patrolled the area with his sharp, calculating eyes scanning every corner of the surroundings. He had walked this beat for over 2 decades, and in his mind, he knew this city better than anyone else on the force. When his gaze landed on Marcus sitting alone on the bench, something in his gut stirred, a feeling he had learned to trust over the years without question. A black man sitting alone, too calm, too composed for his liking. The suspicion prickled at the edges of his thoughts like a warning signal. "Never seen him around here before," Brian muttered under his breath, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. But here's what Officer Harkins didn't know. The man he was watching wasn't just any ordinary citizen enjoying a peaceful afternoon. Marcus Davis was one of the FBI's most decorated special agents, with over 15 years of experience taking down some of the country's most dangerous criminal organizations. He had just returned from a grueling 6-month undercover operation that had resulted in the arrest of 12 high-level drug traffickers. The badge in his pocket carried more weight than Harkins could ever imagine, and the clearance level Marcus held gave him access to classified information that would make the local cop's head spin. Marcus felt the weight of someone's gaze burning into him and slowly looked up from his book. He noticed Brian standing at a distance, staring at him with a look that was all too familiar. Marcus had been in situations like this before, more times than he could count. He could read the officer's expression as easily as the words on the page before him. It was prejudice masquerading as concern, suspicion that had no basis other than the color of his skin, but Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his book slowly, marking the page with his finger, and met Brian's gaze with unwavering confidence. Brian's grip on his baton tightened until his knuckles turned white. He saw the way Marcus looked at him, steady, unafraid, almost challenging. It unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. In his experience, innocent people showed nervousness when a cop watched them. This man's calmness felt like defiance. "Let's see what this guy's up to," Brian muttered, as he started walking toward Marcus, his posture stiffening with each deliberate step. He didn't like how Marcus was looking at him, didn't like the calmness, the complete lack of fear. It was unsettling in a way that made his skin crawl. Marcus watched Brian approach, keeping his expression neutral and professional. He knew exactly what was coming, and had seen this scene play out too many times before. The situation was already loaded with tension, and he knew that how he responded in the next few moments could determine whether this ended peacefully or escalated into something much worse. He wasn't in the mood for this today. He had earned his day off, but he also wasn't going to give the officer any reason to escalate the situation unnecessarily. "Afternoon," Brian said as he reached the bench, his tone artificially polite, but with an unmistakable edge of hostility. His eyes swept over Marcus from head to toe, taking in his clean-cut appearance, expensive watch, and well-maintained clothes, details that should have suggested this wasn't some common criminal. "Afternoon, officer," Marcus replied, his voice calm and even. He kept his hands visible, resting them on the closed book in his lap, a deliberate gesture to show he posed no threat. His years of training had taught him how to de-escalate tense situations, even when he was the target of unwarranted suspicion. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face for any sign of nervousness, then flicking to the book he was holding. He was fishing for something, anything to justify the gnawing feeling in his gut that told him this man didn't belong here. "Just enjoying the park," Marcus said simply. "It's a beautiful day for reading. Is there a problem, officer?" Brian nodded slowly, though he wasn't really listening to the answer. He was more interested in what Marcus wasn't saying, in what he could dig out from beneath the surface of this seemingly innocent encounter. His 20 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming that something was off about this man. "You from around here?" Brian pressed, shifting his weight to a more aggressive stance. Marcus smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around," he said, deliberately keeping his answer vague. He knew that anything he said could be twisted, used against him in whatever narrative this officer was constructing in his head. The non-answer didn't sit well with Brian. He shifted his weight again, his stance becoming more confrontational, more threatening. "Mind if I see some ID?" The question came out more like a command than a request. And this is where things started to spiral out of control. Marcus knew his rights inside and out. He knew he wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park, reading a book on a sunny afternoon. But he also knew from experience that refusing could escalate the situation quickly, potentially dangerously. Still, he wasn't going to let this officer intimidate him. He had faced down drug cartels and terrorist cells. A prejudiced local cop wasn't going to make him back down. "Am I being detained, officer?" Marcus asked, his tone measured and professional. "Have I committed a crime?" He met Brian's gaze without flinching, his FBI training evident in his composed demeanor. Brian bristled at the questions. There was that calmness again, that refusal to be intimidated that made him feel like he was losing control of the situation. His face flushed red with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "You will be if you don't cooperate." Brian shot back, his hand moving to rest on his holster in a clear threat. "I'm conducting an investigation, and you're acting suspicious." "Suspicious how?" Marcus asked quietly. "By reading a book in a public park on my day off?" Brian's jaw tightened. He didn't have a good answer, and they both knew it. But admitting that would mean losing face, losing control, and his pride wasn't about to let that happen. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though even he knew how weak and generic the excuse sounded. "Black male, approximately 40 years old, medium build." Marcus almost laughed at the vague description that could fit thousands of men in the city. "And what exactly is this person wanted for?" he asked, knowing full well that Brian was making this up as he went along. "That's police business," Brian snapped. "Now, are you going to show me some ID, or are we going to have a problem here?" For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension thickening between them like a physical presence. Other park visitors had started to notice the confrontation, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Marcus was acutely aware that this situation was balancing on a knife's edge. He could assert his rights, refuse to comply, and risk this escalating into violence. Or he could comply, knowing that his FBI credentials would eventually expose this officer's prejudice for what it was. Marcus made his decision. Without breaking eye contact, he slowly reached into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I'm reaching for my wallet," he announced clearly, not wanting to give Brian any excuse to claim he felt threatened. Brian watched every movement like a hawk. his body coiled tight as a spring, ready to react at the slightest provocation. When Marcus's hand emerged with a leather wallet, Brian snatched it from his hand with unnecessary force and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the driver's license first, seeing the name Marcus Davis and an address in an upscale neighborhood that didn't match his prejudiced assumptions. But then Brian's eyes caught something else, a second set of credentials behind the license. Before he could examine them closer, Marcus spoke with quiet authority. "You might want to look at the other ID, officer, the one from my employer." Brian's fingers fumbled as he pulled out the second identification, and when he saw it, his blood ran cold. The golden FBI badge gleamed in the afternoon sun, accompanied by credentials that identified Marcus Davis as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The authorization level indicated on the card was higher than anything Brian had ever seen. "Jesus Christ," Brian whispered, his face draining of color. His hands started to shake as the full weight of what he had done began to crash down on him. But here's the thing. Brian's pride wouldn't let him back down, even after seeing those FBI credentials. Can you believe that? Instead of immediately apologizing and walking away, he made the worst decision of his entire career. He actually doubted the authenticity of the badge, convinced himself it might be fake. After all, why would an FBI agent be sitting alone in this park? His prejudice was so deep, so ingrained, that it overrode his common sense. "These could be fake," Brian said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. "I've seen some pretty good counterfeits in my time. You're still coming with me until we can verify this." Marcus's expression hardened. The disrespect was staggering. Here he was, a federal agent with an impeccable service record, being treated like a common criminal by a local cop who couldn't see past the color of his skin. "Officer Harkins," Marcus said, reading the name tag on Brian's uniform, "I strongly advise you to call your supervisor right now. You're making a serious mistake that could end your career." But Brian's ego had taken control. He pulled out his handcuffs, the metal glinting in the sunlight. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back. We'll sort this out at the station." The small crowd that had gathered gasped collectively. Several people were now openly recording the encounter on their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. One elderly woman called out, "Officer, that man wasn't doing anything wrong. I've been watching him read for the past hour." Brian ignored her, his focus laser-sharp on Marcus. "I said turn around. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Marcus stood slowly from the bench, his movements controlled and dignified. He could have easily overpowered Brian. His FBI training included advanced combat techniques that would have had the officer on the ground in seconds. But he knew that would only escalate things further and potentially put innocent bystanders at risk. Plus, every second of this encounter was being recorded, and he wanted the world to see exactly how a law-abiding federal agent was being treated simply because of his race. "I'm complying under protest," Marcus stated clearly, loud enough for the recording phones to capture. "I am Special Agent Marcus Davis with the FBI. Badge number 7841. This arrest is unlawful, and Officer Brian Harkins is violating my civil rights." He turned around slowly, placing his hands behind his back. Brian's hands shook slightly as he applied the handcuffs, perhaps finally beginning to realize the magnitude of his error, but he had crossed the point of no return. His pride, mixed with 20 years of unchecked prejudice, wouldn't let him admit he was wrong. He grabbed Marcus's arm roughly and started leading him toward his patrol car. "You're making a mistake that's going to follow you for the rest of your life," Marcus said calmly as they walked. "But it's not too late to stop this. Radio your captain. Verify my credentials. Save yourself while you still can." Brian's grip tightened on Marcus's arm. Save the threats for someone who cares. You can tell your story to the booking officer. As they reached the patrol car, Brian opened the back door and guided Marcus inside. The metal handcuffs bit into Marcus's wrists, a sensation he had only experienced during training exercises, never as an actual suspect. He settled into the seat, his mind already shifting to what would come next. He wasn't worried about himself. He knew that within hours, maybe less, his identity would be verified and he would be released. But this officer, this Brian Harkins, had just set in motion a chain of events that would destroy everything he had built over 2 decades. The patrol car's engine hummed as Brian drove toward the precinct. His grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled tight as doubt began to creep in. What if the badge was real? What if he had just arrested an actual FBI agent? He glanced in the rearview mirror at Marcus, who sat quietly, his expression unreadable. The man's calmness was unnerving. Every criminal Brian had ever arrested showed some sign of stress, sweating, fidgeting, talking too much or not at all. But Marcus looked like he was simply waiting, like he knew exactly how this would play out. "So, FBI, huh?" Brian said, trying to inject sarcasm into his voice to mask his growing anxiety. "What's a federal agent doing in our little park seems beneath your pay grade." Marcus met Brian's eyes in the mirror. "I was reading a book on my day off, Officer Harkins. Something that apparently looks suspicious when a black man does it." The words stung because they were true. Brian had seen plenty of white people reading in that same park, and he had never given them a second glance. But he pushed that uncomfortable thought away. "You matched a description," he repeated weakly. "What description?" Marcus pressed. "You never gave me specifics. What crime was committed? When? Where? What evidence do you have besides the color of my skin?" Brian didn't answer. He couldn't. They both knew there was no real description, no actual crime, no legitimate reason for this arrest. It had been pure prejudice from the start, and now Brian was trapped by his own actions. As they pulled into the precinct's parking lot, Brian noticed something that made his stomach drop. Several cars he didn't recognize were already there, including a black SUV with government plates. Word had somehow already reached the federal building. He parked near the entrance, his movements suddenly hesitant. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity seemed subdued. Officers looked up as Brian led Marcus through the main hall, and several faces showed recognition. Not of Marcus as a criminal, but of something else. Officer Jenkins, a younger cop who worked the front desk, went pale when he saw who Brian had brought in. "Harkins," Jenkins said quietly, "you need to take him to Captain Bennett's office right now." "I need to process him first," Brian said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Jenkins said firmly, which was unusual for the typically deferential junior officer. "Captain's orders. Straight to her office. The FBI field office has already called." Brian felt the floor dropping out from under him. If the FBI field office was already involved, that meant Marcus's credentials were real. He had arrested a federal agent. His career, his pension, everything he had worked for was suddenly in jeopardy. Captain Laura Bennett's office door was open, and she stood behind her desk with the expression that could have frozen hell. Beside her stood a man in a dark suit who Brian didn't recognize, but who carried himself with obvious federal authority. "Uncuff him, now," Captain Bennett ordered, her voice like ice. Brian fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped them. As the cuffs came off, Marcus rubbed his wrists, the red marks visible against his skin. He straightened his jacket and stood with the dignity that his position deserved. "Agent Davis," the man in the suit said. "I'm Deputy Director Harrison from the field office. I apologize for this inexcusable treatment. Are you injured?" "I'm fine, Deputy Director," Marcus replied professionally. though I believe there are larger issues here that need to be addressed. Captain Bennett turned to Brian, her face a mask of controlled fury. Officer Harkins, you're suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Badge and gun on my desk now. Brian's world crumbled in that moment. His hands trembled as he unclipped his badge, the piece of metal that had defined him for 20 years. His service weapon followed, placed carefully on the captain's desk. Without them, he felt naked, vulnerable, like a crucial part of his identity had been stripped away. "This is a mistake," Brian said weakly. "I was just doing my job." He matched a description. "What description?" Captain Bennett demanded. "Show me the report. Show me the Bolo alert. Show me any legitimate reason you had for arresting this man." Brian's silence was damning. There was no report, no alert, no legitimate reason. Everyone in the room knew it. Deputy Director Harrison spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "Agent Davis is one of our most decorated officers. He's recently returned from an undercover operation that resulted in the largest drug bust in this state's history. The man you treated like a criminal has risked his life countless times to keep this city safe." Can you imagine the humiliation Brian felt standing there? 20 years of service, and it all came crashing down because he couldn't see past his own prejudice. But what happened next would shock everyone in that room. Marcus Davis, the man who had every right to demand Brian's immediate termination, did something unexpected. "Captain Bennett," Marcus said, his voice calm but commanding, "I'd like to speak with Officer Harkins privately for a moment." Everyone in the room looked surprised. Captain Bennett hesitated, then nodded. "5 minutes," she said, and she and Deputy Director Harrison stepped out, closing the door behind them. Brian stood there, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Look at me, Officer Harkins." Brian reluctantly raised his eyes. What he saw in Marcus's face wasn't the anger he expected, but something far more powerful, disappointment mixed with a deep, profound sadness. "Do you know what the worst part of this is?" Marcus asked. "It's not the handcuffs. It's not the humiliation. It's that you've been doing this job for 20 years and you still can't see past the color of someone's skin. How many other innocent black men have you done this to? How many lives have you disrupted or destroyed because of your prejudice?" Brian wanted to defend himself, to say that this was the first time, but they both knew that would be a lie. This was just the first time he had been caught, the first time his victim had the power to fight back. "I have a son," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a different tone. "He's 16, a smart kid, wants to be an engineer. But every day when he leaves the house, I worry. Not about gang members or drug dealers, but about officers like you. Officers who will see his skin color before they see his character, his potential, his humanity." Brian felt something crack inside him. He had a son, too, 18 years old, about to start college. He had never once worried about his son's interactions with police. "I could end your career right now," Marcus said. "One phone call, and you'd never work in law enforcement again. The video from the park is probably already viral, but I'm going to give you a choice, Officer Harkins. You can fight this, deny any wrongdoing, claim you were just following procedure, and let this investigation run its course. You'll probably lose, and even if you somehow keep your job, you'll be the cop who arrested an FBI agent because he was black. That will follow you forever." Brian swallowed hard, waiting for the other option. "Or," Marcus continued, "you can admit what really happened. You can acknowledge that you racially profiled me, that you let your prejudice guide your actions. You can undergo bias training, speak at community meetings about the dangers of racial profiling, and work to become better. Not just as an officer, but as a human being. The choice is yours. Before Brian could respond, there was a knock at the door. Captain Bennett entered, her face grave. "Agent Davis, Officer Harkins, I need to inform you both that the videos from the park have indeed gone viral. We've already received hundreds of calls, and there are news vans pulling up outside." Brian felt his knees go weak. His worst nightmare was becoming reality. His face would be everywhere, synonymous with police racism and abuse of power. "There's more," Captain Bennett continued. "The mayor's office has called. They want a full investigation, not just into this incident, but into Officer Harkins's entire record. Every arrest, every traffic stop, every interaction with minority citizens will be reviewed." Brian thought about all his past arrests, all the times he had acted on instinct rather than evidence. How many of those would hold up under scrutiny? How many lives had he impacted based on nothing more than prejudice? Over the next few hours, the precinct became a circus. News crews surrounded the building, protesters gathered with signs demanding justice, and social media exploded with the hashtag #FBI while black. The video had been viewed millions of times, shared by celebrities, politicians, and civil rights organizations. Brian's face was everywhere, the poster child for everything wrong with modern policing. Brian sat in a small room, watching the news coverage on a mounted TV. Every channel showed the same footage. Him handcuffing Marcus, ignoring the witnesses defending the federal agent, his dismissive treatment of a man who had done nothing wrong. The commentators were brutal in their analysis, pointing out every moment where Brian's prejudice was obvious. Then came the interviews with Marcus's colleagues at the FBI. They spoke of his bravery, his dedication, the numerous commendations he had received. One agent told the story of how Marcus had saved 3 hostages during a bank robbery. Another described how he had spent months undercover in a dangerous cartel, gathering intelligence that saved countless lives. "This is the man Officer Harkins treated like a criminal," one commentator said. "A hero who has dedicated his life to protecting others, arrested for the crime of reading while black." Brian's phone hadn't stopped buzzing. His wife had called dozens of times. His son had texted asking if what he was seeing on social media was true. His fellow officers avoided him, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. He had become radioactive, untouchable. 3 days later, a formal hearing was held. Brian sat at a long table, facing a panel of officials including Captain Bennett, representatives from Internal Affairs, the mayor's office, and Federal Oversight Committee. Marcus was there too, sitting in the gallery, his presence a constant reminder of Brian's failure. The evidence was overwhelming, not just from that day in the park, but from Brian's entire career. Statistics showed that 78% of his arrests over the past 5 years had been of Black or Hispanic individuals, despite the neighborhood he patrolled being predominantly white. Complaints that had been previously dismissed were now being re-examined. Former suspects were coming forward with their own stories of profiling and harassment. When it came time for Brian to speak, he stood slowly. His lawyer had prepared a defense claiming procedural justification, but looking at Marcus at the panel, at the gallery full of community members who had come to witness this moment, Brian made a different choice. "I racially profiled Agent Davis," Brian said, his voice cracking. "I saw a black man in a park where I didn't think he belonged, and I acted on prejudice, not evidence. There was no description, no crime, no legitimate reason for my actions. I let 20 years of unchecked bias guide my decisions, and I'm deeply ashamed." The room was silent. This wasn't what anyone had expected. Brian continued. I've been thinking about what Agent Davis said to me, about his son, about all the sons and daughters who have to fear interactions with officers like me. I became a cop to protect and serve, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of who I was protecting and who I was viewing as a threat. That failure is mine alone. He turned to face Marcus directly. Agent Davis, I know an apology can't undo what I did, but I am truly, deeply sorry. Not just for arresting you, but for all the times I've acted on prejudice rather than principle. You deserved better. They all deserved better. Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology without accepting or rejecting it. The panel deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, Captain Bennett delivered the verdict. Brian Harkins was terminated from the police force, effective immediately. He would lose his pension and be permanently barred from working in law enforcement. Additionally, he would face civil rights charges that could result in federal prosecution. As Brian left the building for the last time, no longer Officer Harkins but just another civilian, he passed a group of young black men standing outside. One of them looked at him and said, "Maybe now you understand what we go through every day." Brian nodded, the weight of understanding finally, truly hitting him. He had lost everything: his career, his reputation, his identity as a protector. But in that loss, he had gained something too. The painful knowledge of the harm he had caused and the opportunity, perhaps, to make amends. Marcus Davis returned to his work at the FBI, but the incident had changed something. He began speaking at police academies, sharing his story and working to train new officers about implicit bias and the dangers of racial profiling. He turned his humiliation into education, his pain into progress. The lawsuit that followed resulted in a $3.5 million settlement for Marcus, which he donated entirely to organizations working to improve police-community relations and support victims of racial profiling. He said in a press conference, "This was never about money. It was about accountability and change." Brian Harkins, meanwhile, began attending community meetings, listening to stories from people who had experienced what Marcus had experienced. He volunteered with organizations working to reform policing, using his story as a cautionary tale. It didn't erase what he had done, but it was a start. 6 months later, at a community forum on police reform, Marcus and Brian found themselves on the same panel. The moderator asked Marcus, "Do you forgive Officer Harkins for what he did?" Marcus thought for a long moment before answering. "Forgiveness isn't mine alone to give. He didn't just wrong me. He wronged every person he profiled, every family he disrupted with his prejudice. But I believe in redemption. I believe people can change. Whether Mr. Harkins truly changes, only time will tell." And that's the thing about prejudice. It doesn't just destroy its victims. It ultimately destroys those who carry it too. Brian Harkins learned that lesson the hardest way possible. He went from being a 20-year veteran officer to a cautionary tale, his name forever linked with the racial profiling scandal that ended his career.